Alright guys, we're going to go ahead and do our lecture cell parts part 2. And I want to go through the different parts we've been learning about in class, starting with the cell membrane. This is the essentially like the skin of the cell that controls what can move in and out of the cell. We refer to the cell membrane as semi-permeable. Semi-permeable means that it sometimes allows certain things to move through it. So certain things can come in and out of the cell, whereas other things are not allowed to move through it. So it is semi-permeable. We're going to talk about the permeability, the semi-permeability of the cell membrane in more detail in class with some activities and labs. But I want to look at this a little closer. You can see it kind of peeling away here. And if we look at these individual little pieces of the cell membrane, they're little lipids. Okay, they're called phospholipids. Looks like a head and two little tails coming off of it. And these are pretty important. If I go back for a minute and you look closer at this, you can see the head and the tails all lined up very closely to each other. And you have two layers, so it's called a phospholipid bilayer. And one layer, on both layers actually, the tails face each other. So you have, the outside of the cell here, the inside of the cell here, and here's the membrane, the barrier between the outside and the inside world of a cell. Now, the two tails here of the lipid, well, actually, let's start with the head, the phosphate, the head of the lipid. What do I want to tell you about this? I think what I want to do is kind of save this piece and what the tail piece is for in class, because there's a few things I'd like to show you about that. But for now, what you should know, cell membrane is semi-permeable, and it allows, there's a double layer, a bilayer of lipids that allow for things to move through and keep certain things from moving through. And the number one thing you can remember here is that that lipid is a fat. Alright, so this is basically like an oil in a sense, and its main thing here is it's controlling the movement of water that can come into the cell and leave the cell. When you start to lose control of that movement, then a number of things can happen. One, if you're having too much water moving out, you're dehydrating. If you're having too much water moving in, you're doing the opposite. You're essentially hydrating your cells to the point where something dangerous can happen. Here's a little story of a woman in California who died in a radio station contest called Hold Your Wee for a Wee. What they had to do was drink a whole bunch of water, and whoever could keep from going to the bathroom the longest would actually win a Wii PlayStation, right? And she didn't win, but unfortunately what happened was she had overloaded her body with so much water that it's called water intoxication. It's called intoxication because you kind of behave as if you were intoxicated. You get dizzy, have a hard time standing up, your head starts to really hurt. And essentially what happened is she had so much water that the water was moving into her cells too much, causing her cells to swell up with too much water, bursting, and she basically died from that. She had like an encephalitis, a swelling of the brain, and led right to her death. So this is it's not very common, but it happens. And we'll talk about the water movement in and out of cells. We call that osmosis. We'll talk about that in class. So that was the cell membrane. The next part is the nucleus of the cell. Remember in class we talked about this being like the brain of the cell. It's the brain of the cell because it contains your DNA. All right? And the DNA is essentially a recipe. It's a recipe that if you know how to decode it, all the code is right down through here. We'll learn about this as well. If you learn how to decode it, it gives you the recipe for making protein. All right? Now, what makes the protein? These things. Outside of the nucleus are little ribosomes all over the place. They are your protein makers. They will take the recipe from DNA, they will decode it, and they will essentially make the cake from that recipe. They make the protein. Once the proteins are made, it needs to be transported through the cell. It is transported by something called the endoplasmic reticulum. There's two types of endoplasmic reticulum, rough and smooth. The rough ER is rough because it has ribosomes all over it, making the proteins and immediately putting it on this conveyor belt to move it through the cell. The smooth ER does not have those ribosomes, so it's just moving the proteins through the cell. Right? So that's like the conveyor belt of the cell that moves proteins throughout the cell, and in some cases outside of the cell. It sends them somewhere else into the body. But oftentimes before they get moved out of the cell, they need to be repackaged. They need to be sorted out, packaged, modified a little, and that happens right here in the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi is the packaging center of the cell. It takes those proteins as well as other materials being made in the cell, and it sorts them, modifies them, and repackages them before they get sent on their way. Alright, now all of this stuff needs energy to happen. You can't just have proteins being made unless you have an energy supply. Where does the energy supply come from? Right here, the mitochondria. The mitochondria produces what we call ATP through a process referred to as cellular respiration. We are going to learn a lot about cellular respiration. It's a very complicated process. We're going to learn some of the ins and outs of cellular respiration. It all happens within this right here, the mitochondria, where energy is being made. Now, some cells in your body have more mitochondria than others. For example, your muscle cells have a whole bunch of mitochondria because your muscles need a lot of energy to do the jobs that they do. All right, from there, we have a lysosome. A lysosome is a little organelle found in your cell that essentially acts as a recycling center. It takes all these broken down and beat up pieces of the cell, and if it can reuse them, the lysosome will take them, break them down, and have them reused, recycle them, or just break them down and get rid of them. So a lysosome is like the garbage and the recycling center of the cell. All right, the next part is the vacuole. Animal cells have vacuoles, but they tend to be much smaller. Plant cells they have vacuoles that are much larger. So this is a plant cell, so you can really see it. And this whole area in here filled with water and nutrients for the cell. It's kind of like a storage tank. In the case I talked about earlier, the hold your wee for a wee, she was getting too much water in her cells, and they were literally bursting. If you have a plant that's not watered enough, that vacuole will dehydrate and empty out, causing the plant to wilt, because literally the cells will shrivel up and the whole plant will wilt over. That's where I'm going to end for today, and we'll pick up on this stuff in class.